When we started this discussion and we were talking about preserves, one of the points was that came out is you don't want to just preserve the species. You need to be trying to preserve it's not just the animal, you have to preserve the habitat. And the problem that you run into with any of these preserves, and I'm so happy we have these preserves, but the problem you run into is the same thing that we saw in Yellowstone. We had said that they introduced 30 wolves, and after 20 years, the wolf population is over 300, and they're moving out into the farmland. And so really, the first question before I talk about that, I want to talk about how big is big enough. So when you are developing and building a preserve, the question is how large an area do you need in order to maintain this biodiversity? And so there's an interesting experiment that's going on in Brazil, and what they're doing. Let's see if you can see this. What they're doing is they're doing an experiment where they have preserves, everything from a small, a few acres to thousands of acres, and they're cutting the forest around them. And then they're leaving in, so these are isolated preserves, and then they're saying, well, we're going to monitor biodiversity in each of these, and we're trying to figure out how big an area do we need in order to protect biodiversity? Okay, so that's one of the experiments. I started out actually talking about this second idea. So with Yellowstone, we had said, yes, we did a really good job with those wolves by reintroducing them, but they're outgrowing the area. And what's the problem you're going to have? You have a isolated gene pool. And so the problem is how do you deal with the fact that no matter how big a preserve is, it's essentially an island. It's an island of genetics. They're separated. I mean, in Yellowstone, we have wolves. In Canada, you have wolves. And maybe in Minnesota, in northern Minnesota, we do. But there's no connection between the preserves. And so now people are starting to talk about something called connectivity ecology. And what that means is we have all of these preserves, especially in the western U.S. and extending up into Canada. And how do you make it so that the wildlife can move from one to the other? So I've drawn these circles up here with these blue corridors, and the answer is this thing I wrote right here: wildlife corridors, allowing the wildlife to move from one location to another to a third, so that you can get a flow of genes and keep a nice mix of genes within your population. Now, one of the things, I grew up in the South, and there's kind of maybe a little more land available, although there's certainly in Pennsylvania lots of wide open spaces. But one of the things I always used to think about is there are all these divided highways. You're going down the highway, and northbound is here, and then you've got woods, and southbound is over there. And I've always thought that these little, in some cases they're, 50 yards wide, in other cases they're, 200 yards wide. But these are little wildlife reserves. And so in some ways, maybe we could tap into some of these bigger spaces that already exist to help develop these wildlife corridors. But anyway, that is sort of on the horizon with regards to how to produce a better preserve. All right, so this is the end of chapter 6, and that means we're going to have a test. We got a test coming up. I'll let you know more about that in an announcement through Blackboard. All right, guys, have a good day.